my entire life and job is about battling speciesism in whatever aspect I possibly can. And because I am a master of disaster management, I also love to talk about it with disaster management. We are coming upon our monsoon season in Vietnam. This will be, I think, my 10th year. But I also grew up in the Gulf Coast of the United States and on the Atlantic and the mid-Atlantic, where I've gone through many hurricanes. And so kind of my specialty is big storms, flooding, tornadoes, all sorts of nasty things. And I am also a former horse mother. I currently am a pig, chicken, hedgehog, dog, and cat mom. So anyway, I work a lot with protecting my animals during the during monsoon season at this point. And let me make sure I want to get myself out of the way. Here we go. Hang on. Let me go back. Again, I can't really see anything at this point. My eyes stop working at about 7 p.m. Right. So why does speciesism even matter? Why do people even talk about speciesism in climate change related disasters? Well, frankly, they don't talk about speciesism and climate change related disasters. And I find this quite frustrating. One of the main reasons is because raising animals for human consumption is the second largest source of anthropogenic greenhouse gases, creating climate change related disasters. And it's generally accepted by people who read and are not Republicans that 14 to 18% of the generally of the animal greenhouse gases comes from animal agriculture, and it's more than global transportation. For some reason, this just sort of gets lost in the discussion of disaster management, and I find that to be a bit bizarre, particularly because it kills more individual non-human animals per year than humans in any disasters. However, the messaging is always quite interesting in this. So animal deaths are always described in terms of economic losses. Unless they're cute enough, right? Remember the wildfires of 2019, 2020 in Australia? Oh, the poor koalas. Not to mention the millions of farmed animals who were also burned alive at that time. I'll get to that in a second, but it just kind of depends on what body you were born into as to whether you are an economic loss or a tragedy. So this is really the problem: loss of life versus loss of property. So the property status of animals is really what causes speciesism to begin with. Not causes it. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think it's connected. So this picture is actually from Vietnam. This is from just a couple of years ago. This was 2020, and we had in Vietnam, the central Vietnam was hit by like something ridiculous, like 7 typhoons or something, and massive flooding. And this was, you know, just your average small farm of pigs where nobody was evacuated naturally, and they just floated around in the floodwaters. So we're ignoring the 70 billion land animals that we raise annually for human consumption and disaster management. And this is detrimental to human health. It's detrimental to climate change, and it is very much detrimental to global food security. Something that we've managed to divorce from disaster management for some reason, though I shouldn't say divorce because it sounds like they were ever married and that discussion ever happened. But we haven't seen that yet, unfortunately. So we have seen some progress. Right. And we just heard about this with our previous wonderful speaker who gave us some good information, particularly from Latin America. And interesting because I remember I was actually in Chaitin in the volcano. I think he was talking about there in Chile, in which the animals did not get evacuated and they were running around and it was quite a mess. Anyway, pet species in some countries are being allowed at evacuation centers, which is great, because for a really long time they weren't. Sometimes they have separate evacuation centers that are separate from the humans, but some in the United States and other countries are putting them together. Farm animals are a little bit different because they've got nowhere to go. They are property, and so naturally as property, they are either insured privately or their losses are paid for by the government, such as in Vietnam. So these were, you know, compensated. The farmer there, he was compensated by the Vietnamese government for the loss of his animals that were left to drown to death in concrete boxes. I don't know if you can actually make that go away. Set up. Okay. So basically, speciesism and mitigation and responses in both messaging and policy. I'm going to give you a really recent example from British Columbia. So they had kind of a triple threat in 2021, where they had the heat dome, where the heat got up to 49 degrees Celsius, killed just in chickens alone. It killed 651,000 chickens in just this very small area, and 600 humans. Really interesting disparity there. Then 1,600 wildfires throughout the region were due to the heat and the drought. Yeah. And as a result of wildfires, of course, that makes floods so much worse, because then there's nothing to stop the water from going everywhere. Erosion is much worse. That killed 700,000 farmed animals and 3 million bees drowned. But right, who gives a damn about bees? Well, except for the fact that when they die, we all do too. The interesting thing is that if you look up the media on it, just kind of your average Canadian online news, the first quote is from that. It said, farmers say that the last people who want to see farm animals injured or killed, which I find fascinating considering their full-time job is to kill farmed animals. But really what happened is it eats into their profits, and they have to cope with the emotional toll of cleaning up carcasses. So as somebody who for a living watches preventable suffering and death, I just had an animal die in my arms just about 2 nights ago at an emergency. And I understand dealing with carcasses and burying bodies at 7 o'clock at night before dinner isn't all that much fun. But burying, you know, your livelihood in that regard, also probably not that much fun. The emotional toll, I have no doubt, is very heavy. But ultimately, they're talking about the people. The people are the victims, not the 700,000 animals that drowned to death. The Animal Justice Party in Canada at the time said the Animal Justice is calling on governments to take urgent action and provide legislation to protect animals on farms from the climate. How would you do that? You've got animals on farms that are creating climate change. How are you going to protect them from the climate that they're destroying as it is? The best way to do that would be to provide legislation that would assist the farmers to transition away from animal farming and into plant agriculture. It's much easier to recover from a whole bunch of oats being underwater than it is to have a whole bunch of dead dairy cows. Yeah? So that was just British Columbia. So like I said, so the US post-Hurricane Katrina is very interesting. So the Stafford Act in the United States is what starts the process of federal emergency assistance. Once the president kind of puts that forward, it kind of goes from the government to the president and FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. That after post-Katrina, a hurricane that was very close to where my parents live, my sister lost her house in Katrina in 2005. She was able to evacuate her animals because she had the means to do so, but a lot of people did not. And a lot of them died. And so we amended the Stafford Act, allowing household pets to be part of emergency response and evacuation. However, if my sister's pets were like mine, farmed animals, pig that sleeps in my bed, or, you know, commercial animals, racing animals like greyhound racing they have on the Gulf Coast, reptiles. If my sister's best friend was a snake, he would not be allowed. Fishes, things like this, they're not included. Right. And like I said before, the 3 billion animals that were killed during the 2019 to 2020 Australian fires included, mostly if you read about it online, and the messaging in the media includes koalas and kangaroos, as if they're the only ones out of 3 billion animals that suffered from burning to death. In spite of the fact that many of those animals were cows predominantly in those areas that were left to die because there is nowhere to take them. As we discussed in the previous speaker, the technical rescue of large animals is quite difficult, particularly in rapid onset disaster. So the cost of species disaster management policies are, if you want to talk about people, because we're animals too, let's go ahead. Carcasses and waste pools overflow from farms, right? there's all sorts of yucky things that come out of that. Typhoons and floods, which are your two most common climate change related disasters that affect animals. Obviously, droughts are a whole other thing. I could do a whole other presentation just on droughts. Zoonotic diseases coming from a whole lot of poo. Yeah, there's a whole lot of poo that comes out of livestock, and farmed animals carry a whole lot of things that go through the water and get humans sick. Also, when you do manage to evacuate large numbers of farmed animals of unknown health status in most countries, and they tend to be mixed with others, and then there's animal and human disease spread. Global food security, one of my favorite sentences to say on a daily basis, probably right up there with the F word considering my job. I would say farmed animals are not disaster resilient sources of food or income compared to most crops. I can say that potentially because I'm in Vietnam and one of the most disaster resilient crops happens to be rice, quite luckily, and we've got quite a bit of it. But in general, it's much easier, like I said, to replace oats than it is to replace dairy cows. It's much cheaper as well. And whether it's a fire, whether it's a drought, whether it's a flood or a typhoon, these are all still much easier to replace and much cheaper than if you were to have farmed animals. Also, so if you've got a whole bunch of large animals, particularly, it uses a lot of resources such as land, water, feed, all of these things that would otherwise should be used for humans in disaster relief, instead of animals that should never have been born to feed a human population that's fully capable of living on plants. So recovering plant-based agriculture is faster, cheaper, and more effective than replacing animal-based food systems. The data is all there. I'm more than happy to share that. So I also used to live in Mongolia because apparently I like differences in climate. So it's boiling hot. I have a fan on me right now, but Mongolia gets rather cold during the winter. And we have something called a tsud. The tsud, there's 5 different kinds, but the one that I was there for in 2009 to 2010 was an extreme snowfall covered by a layer of ice. And that makes it impossible for the for the farmed animals to dig to get to the grass that's underneath. So if the snow is soft and fluffy, they're able to eat. If you've got a layer of ice on it, Mongolian ice is, they're not kidding. It's pretty serious. It's like ice skating through your winter wherever you're going in the city. But anyway, they can't get to the ice and they starve to death and die. The interesting thing was it kind of had like a double problem, like we were talking about in British Columbia, which was the summer drought, which prevented them from having the forage necessary stored up for the winter tsud. So 22% of all farmed animals in Mongolia, a country the size of Western Europe with 3.4 million people in it. No, not three, I guess 3.4 million people. So 7 million goat, sheep, horses, and cows were killed. So global warming, we always think about as being warming, right? But what happens is actually as you are warming the climate, precipitation is actually growing. And if you're already in a cold place like Mongolia, where temperatures would easily get down to -40, -50, Canada, or places in northern Canada. I'm sending a dog to Winnipeg this month, and it's going to be like -30 in a few months, or places in Siberia. The precipitation continues to come. This is its own type of disaster. So the problem that I have with speciesism and disaster management is that we are really pissing into the wind here. And if we do not discuss the root causes of climate change related disaster and in mitigation, right? Okay, so we always want to talk about business continuity, and that involves farming, because many communities, especially the one that I'm in now, a lot of economic activity is based on farming animals or farming, well, other kinds of things, crops as well. But mitigation, the word mitigation requires addressing the root causes. And a major one of those root causes is animal agriculture. We have separated disaster management from global food security, and it is a grave mistake.
Excuse me, Catherine.
Yes.
Can you please conclude? We are running
absolutely
behind the schedule, so please.
Yeah, we are a little bit behind. You're right. So I just had one more slide. I'm going to finish it up really super fast. So yeah, I already said that. So we have to acknowledge the root cause of climate change related disasters. And by doing so, we need to mitigate the effects of disasters by not supporting animal agriculture, but supporting plant-based farming transitions and alternative protein industries. Disaster response for the large number of animals raised for food is impossible. Money better spent on ending the need for their rescue and carcass removal. Evacuation centers, managing disease control, transport, vet supplies, all of these resources are unrealistic for the vast majority of the planet. We need to get real here. Speciesism is disastrous in disaster management, mitigation, and response. So anyway, thank you very much.
This paper wishes to examine photographic representations of animal life in the post-disaster landscapes of Chernobyl and Fukushima. By examining the work of photographers working with multiple media and at the intersection of art photography, photojournalism, animal, environmental, and anti-nuclear activism, species rescue, fostering, and caregiving in these radioactive sites, my analysis aims to understand how specific modes of visual engagement with and interpretation of non-human life in places affected by anthropogenic and climatic disasters interacts with scientific and popular cultural imaginaries of non-human flourishings and endangerments in disaster ecologies, particularly tropes that posit animal life in depopulated sites of nuclear disaster as both miraculously immune to the biological damage caused to humans by radiation exposure, as well as thriving in the wake of human evacuation, particularly in the absence of farming, industrial, and commercial activity. Reading of the works of Julia Oldham, Yasusuke Ota, and Pier Paolo Mitica, and placing their photographic work in dialogue with a recent turn in biopolitical inquiry that seeks to reconfigure Foucault's analysis of biopower in relation to the current reinscriptions of life, livability, and politics within the structures and infrastructures set in place by neoliberal geopolitical regimes of extractive and planet-burning consumption and control in the Anthropocene, my paper wishes to engage with the implicit dialogue between such radioactive ecologies in post-disaster sites, in the wake of evacuation and abandonment, and the ways in which visual media, particularly photography, participate in these ecological arrangements by encoding animal life and its survival in the post-human aftermath of human departure within several symbolic and semantic codes. Julia Oldham's visual projects, photographs of dogs living in the exclusion zone and an accompanying documentary, Fallout Dogs, frame the companion species as a figure of the quintessential survivor of a nuclear apocalypse. The stray animal is the series' unexpected hero. Survivors of ecocide and inheritors of a destroyed habitat, the dogs of Pripyat are atypical candidates for heroic or messianic roles. Oldham's work, undertaken in collaboration with guides and local residents of the exclusion zone, dwells in the rich interpretive possibilities of this dissonance, toying with the visual world building inspired by Chernobyl's resurgent animal populations. In these photographs, liminal figures of homeless dogs occupying a fuzzy hybrid threshold between wild and tame, feral and domestic, outside and inside, stray and pet, ask us to rethink what concepts of heroism, salvation, survival, and resurrected life might look like, removed from their moorings in the grand eschatological narratives and reconfigured in relation to the minor, quotidian, unglamorous, and monotonous registers of the animal's daily, even habitual negotiations with its Umwelt. Oldham's Chernobyl triptych, using resources of multiple mediums and genres, still photography, documentary cinema, stylized digital photo collages that make up the Dogs of Future Earth, series, depart from conventions of doomsday scenarios and carefully steer clear of the imposition of an overtly didactic point of view, even as they subversively and playfully mobilize generic tropes, most commonly those of science fiction and fantasy. Thus, in an opposite move from the visual templates of wild profusion popularized by photographers like David Macmillan and Robert Polidori, Oldham's focus is not so much on the purported reclamation and dissolution of human structures by floral and faunal flourishings. Instead, her photography unpacks questions of symbiotic coexistence, co-constitution, and caregiving as valid ethical responses, practices, and modes of collectively witnessing damaged ecosystems by following and documenting modes of adaptation, occupation, and use by which animals establish new relations with old topographies without necessarily displacing or usurping these. Oldham's futuristic settings, while celebrating canine ingenuity and resourcefulness, continually index the close links that these so-called future Earth settings, landfills, toxic ruins, and e-waste dumps share with current landscapes of environmental degradation. In these techno-dystopias, radiation's invisible and spectral presence haunts these photos in their extended commentary on the politics of planetary toxification and critique of modernity's instrumental reason, of which the nuclear fallout serves as at once allegory and catalyst. Oldham's photos in Fallout Dogs, taken during her stay in the exclusion zone, are intimate portraits of a form of multi-species coexistence that has emerged in abandoned topographies, and what Jonathan Turnbull, in relation to his own visual ethnography of human-canine relationships in the zone, calls, quote, new forms of living, dying, and caring in relation to toxic exposures, unquote. In these images, we see dogs, all of them named and identified, juxtaposed with depopulated urban structures. Their lively and playful postures contrasted with the somber starkness of monumental constructions. The animal's ludic absorption in and attunement to its immediate environment is placed in an ironic contrast with the now empty symbolism of Pripyat's decrepit Soviet-era iconography. Low-angle, decentered shots of dogs lounging in front of memorial statuary, exploring the ramparts of derelict buildings, or using abandoned structures as sites of frolic, rest, and exploration offer modes of recontextualizing the disaster by offering a dog's eye view of ruins. However, Oldham's photos are not oblivious to the permeation of this material environment by radioactive toxicity. In a series of close-ups of feeding dogs, the presence of the animal bone at the focal center of the photograph not only alludes to questions of survival, violence, particularly threats from wolves and foxes, with whom the dogs share a common habitat, and kinds of exposures to harm and danger that are embedded in the very ecosystem, entering the dog's body in the form of radionuclides, in the highly saturated soil, or genetic mutations undergone by birds and insects that enter the food chain. The feral memento mori also foregrounds the spectral omnipresence of death and disease as integral to irradiated sites like Chernobyl. In his photo-voicing project on canine-human companionship in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, Turnbull observes that while the specific scientifically measurable and theorizable effects of radiation on animal biology continues to remain a matter of controversial debate and speculation, new kinds of affective bonds and social norms of companionship and reciprocity, distributed ownership and collective care, or detached forms of engagement that are more loosely structured than those with household pets, for instance, have emerged in the radioecological landscape based in a, quote, potential for shared exposure which reveals a shared animality, unquote. This intersectional space, where common threats from radiation, loneliness, disease, and wild animals, and shared grounds of resources and labor, guarding checkposts, patrolling desolate spaces, surviving attenuated climatic conditions, foster relationships between working-class security personnel and dogs, is neither an apocalyptic wasteland nor a primordial Eden. Rather, it is a site that generates new forms of attention, attunement, and interdependence, where the centrality of the anthropocentric norm is replaced by post-humanist reconfigurations of concepts of personhood, autonomy, sovereignty, and agency in relation to terminal sites of risk and finitude. The intimate playfulness of Oldham's photos is, however, missing from Yasusuke Ota's semi-documentary portraits of animal subjects caught in abandoned city spaces in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima reactor meltdown. A combination of humor and pathos informs Ota's meticulous documentation of the fate of escaped pets and farm animals, abandoned livestock and shelter animals in the days following the triple disasters. We see a solitary ostrich loitering in an abandoned neighborhood, distressed and fatigued pigs trying to cool themselves in a pothole, traumatized pets wandering through rubble, cattle patiently waiting for the return of humans. As the title of the series, Abandoned Animals of Fukushima, indicates, abandonment is a central informing theme of Ota's photography, where a conscious parallel is constantly suggested between the bodies of the urban animals and the derelict and empty post-evacuation habitats that they find themselves in. However, as an active volunteer who participated in rescue, rehabilitation and care of abandoned pets and farm animals, Ota is careful not to suggest a too neat and unproblematic symbolic collapse between material ruin and abandoned critters. The question of care is at the heart of Ota's post-disaster animal photography. Entering the Fukushima no-go zone illegally as a volunteer, Ota, along with a group of civilian animal activists, were among the first responders to cater to the non-human victims of the tsunami nuclear disaster. In the event of the disaster, the government's immediate response with regard to animals was that of culling. Considered to be toxic, animals including livestock and strays were shot as part of the government's cleanup and disaster management efforts. In an essay accompanying his photos, Ota attributes his documentary impulse to the government's inadequate and callous treatment of suffering animals, including forced secrecy, misinformation, and restricted access to places with trapped and injured animals. A trenchant and ironic illustration of this critique is the image of an ostrich, later found to be the mascot of TEPCO, the company owning the nuclear plant, walking down an empty street. While captured as a documentary vignette of the new ordinary in the aftermath of the disaster, the affective potential of the image lies in its staging of discordances and jarring discrepancies that telescopes the living experience of the catastrophe by performatively elaborating the cognitive challenge and perceptual disorientation that is shared by human and animal survivors of large-scale calamities. The outlandish spatial tableau created by the presence of an exotic wild animal in the symmetrical layout of a modern urban neighborhood, walking alongside road signs and neatly arranged residential blocks, while serving as an absurdist allegory of the excesses of the Capitalocene, also comments on the animal's vulnerability under capitalism's sacrificial conditions. In the apocalyptic scenographies of Pier Paolo Mittica, photography acquires narrative dimensions as scenes of depletion, death, mourning, and exhaustion, human and non-human, are mediated through, set against, and analogized in relation to an extended topology of disaster. Dramatic, dark clouds, rocky and rugged terrain brought into sharp, almost three-dimensional relief, architectural rubble, crane and dirt on the bodies and hazmat suits of cleanup workers, skeletal remains of dead animals, and shadows and lines furrowing the contours of human skin collectively constitute an embodied topography where the vestiges of radioactive contamination are inscribed photographically in the image's articulation of bodily duress and debilitation produced by living and laboring in toxic aftermaths of anthropogenic disasters. If the central paradox of photographing nuclear disaster is radiation's invisibility, in Mittica's photographs, atomic invisibility is transcribed through a process of visibilizing other forms of invisibilization of lives, labor, communities, and affects under capitalism's construction of particular sensory regimes, or what Jacques Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. A particularly poignant image from Mittica's nuclear trilogy project is that of farm animals at their stations, juxtaposed with long decomposed skeletal remains of their fellow creatures. A cow gazes piercingly into the camera. Yet unlike Berger's characterization of the vacant look of the captured animal that has been denuded of all agency, here the image's pictorial language reanimates the creaturely look, but not as an anthropomorphic projection of sentimentalized emotion or an allegorical representation of suffering that Ethicists like Peter Singer privilege as a mark of the animal's legal status and moral value. In the photo, the camera is placed low, almost at ground level, eschewing the human subject's bipedal and upright vantage and distending the frame to contextualize the lone animal in a wider matrix of entropy and loss. An off-center and tilted perspective coupled with an eerie light seems to both bifurcate the scene and provide the flat pictorial surface with the depth that signals the image's location and time, informed by historical forces, rather than being a mere snapshot of the animal as an object of visual consumption and commodification. This particular arrangement, instead of petrifying the creaturely gaze, liberates it as an affective vector, a disorienting and discomforting charge that erupts while destabilizing existing modes of spectatorship. The animal's gaze brings our eye level to the ground, where in a corner next to the live creature lie the bones of a dead one, its body still chained to the spot. Suggesting a painful and protracted death by starvation while waiting to be rescued, that as scholarship on Fukushima's animals indicate was the shared fate of many. Here the image generates its own interpretive conditions, creating a visual idiom of mourning where grief is not a solely human emotion and acts of feeling the animal's suffering are not based in a translation of animal affects from the perspective of human moral and ethical norms regarding the definition of what constitutes suffering. Instead, the photograph's proximity to death, decay, and survival as a set of material effects with which the image as a material object and photography as a cultural practice with ecological ties and implications share a common ground, enables us to encounter non-human articulations of loss and grieving outside the semantic limitations imposed by anthropocentric rubrics. What does rewilding look like in sites that are irreversibly irradiated by toxic substances? What behavioral patterns, ecological interdependencies, and modes of survival do animals in these regions adopt, especially where the very experience of disaster is not instantaneous or spectacular, but a form of slow and incremental seepage of toxicity and harm, and where the dispersed and distended temporal scale occasions complex niches of pleasure, joy, playfulness, and companionship between species consigned to a common horizon of damage, thus making clear-cut divisions between doomsday scenarios and lively flourishing difficult to be drawn. The photographs explored in this paper attempt to engage these questions, while also alerting us to the largely anthropocentric epistemic and juridical frameworks within which categories of suffering, precarity, victimhood, and debility are configured. Frameworks in which visual mediums participate as producers and mobilizers of the discursive and semantic horizons of what is seen and the ways in which viewing operates. Thank you.
It's a beautiful day here today. I wish you could have seen the macaws that have just passed by my window. I think as a reminder why we are all here today, to make sure that these animals are listened and can go on living in this planet. So my topic here today is the depiction of non-human animals in the media. We did a case study of Brazilian Pantanal disasters, and it is part of a larger research that's being held here about relationships between human and non-human animals in contemporary society since 2012. And we moved to Pantanal, we moved our focus to Pantanal since 2016. At the beginning, it was about tourism, but then the disasters came along and we shifted our subject. What we are studying now is the non-human animals representation in the media and how it impacts the other animals' lives. In this specifically research, we did a content analysis, and our theoretical framework is the one of critical animal studies. So it's an interdisciplinary approach, but our main theory here is the sociological scale that was developed by Arnold Arluke and Clinton Sanders. It's important to tell you that Pantanal is the world's largest tropical wetland. Its territory is located in Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia, and it's one of the best places in the world to spot wildlife. But it is also one of the most endangered biomes in the world, due to anthropic actions such as mining, hydroelectric power plants interference, deforestation, poaching, and monoculture expansion. And it's important to tell you that we are also in a situation of self-domestication. Wild animals are moving to the cities in order to survive. They are changing their culture and their behaviors. They are becoming more prone to approach human, and the situation is being accelerated by the disasters. So we are facing a major cultural change. We will have to face conflicts and ways to live with these animals in these situations. In 2020, 1/3 of Pantanal was burned. Investigations have proved that most of it were set on purpose. People set fires on purpose. It was the biggest disasters the biome have faced, and 7 million vertebrates were directly killed by the fire. At least 6 million vertebrates and 4 billion invertebrates were affected. After the fire, we have a problem that we call the great hunger. The animals can't find food anymore, and most of them die of starvation. In 2020, we had the worst drought in Paraguay's river history. We are facing droughts that are getting more severe every year, and Pantanal has lost 16% of its water mass between 2008 and 2016. We had also the flooded area. It's decreasing every year, and some studies shows us that at least 23% of our flooded area it has decreased. And this is a big problem because water is the life of Pantanal, and the animals depend on that. We all depend on that, but in Pantanal, it's super important. So by former research, we know that press influence human consideration to other animals. We decided to study the disasters and see how the media depiction influence people. We know that most people will never ever see a whale or a jaguar, but despite that, they grow affectionate with these animals. They grow fond with them. And we understand that it's because of the media, because of the movies, the stories, the news reports. So it's very important that the media depicts these animals in an anti-speciesist way. We studied the news reports of 2 major Brazilian websites in 2020 and 2021, the Online Universe and the G1, and we analyzed 191 news reports. The sociological scale tells us that we categorize animals to insert them in our society project. So we have good animals, which are the tools, the cattle, the guinea pigs, and we have the pets. The key word here is submissive. Submissive animals, submissive to human animals are good animals. And bad animals are the ones that defy their social positions, the vermin, the freaks, and the demons. So we were looking if media depicts these animals in the disasters as good or bad animals. We could see that most news portrayed animal suffering, especially during the fires. And it was really important because Pantanal was on fire for months. And the public commotion, the public actions only began when the situation was being shown by the media. Most of the news depicted the pain, the hunger, the thirst, and the death, but focusing on wild animals. They were depicted as victims, and their suffering, their conscience, their subjectivity was displayed at all times. We even have some animal celebrities that were helped by humans, like this jaguar, and they became super popular. On the other hand, we have cattle in Pantanal. And for these animals, the depiction was not the same. They were depicted, they were portrayed only as commodities or economical losses. They were treated as mere tools. And it is a problem because we did interviews with volunteers that went to Pantanal to help the animals. And especially in 2020, some of them even told me that they were forbade to help cattle. It's important to think about that because when media display an animal as a tool, people won't care about them. They will only be seen as an object, and it impacts their lives. We also have a situation that is very difficult to explain to you, but I'll try. Some government ministers start to tell that we should have more cattle in Pantanal because they would prevent fires by the act of stamping the grass, which is not an accurate theory. It appeared a lot on the news with the term ox firemen. We never had more cattle in Pantanal, and it's not a key to solve the problem. The problem is that our flooded area is decreasing. So media depiction doesn't show the complexity of the problems that Pantanal are facing. But when it shows animal suffering, it moves society. We could see that due to the news reports, because of it, we had a wave of activism, fundraising, awareness campaign, and society pressured the government to take responsibility for the situation. We had a lot of NGOs that were created in 2020 because of the fires, like this one, the Animal Society, that now that helped the animals during the fires, during the droughts, and now is offering veterinary aid to Pantanal's pets. So what we could see is that the media, the press, is a powerful tool to discuss speciesism. In this specific research, we could see that all animals were portrayed as submissive to humans. So now we live in a society that all animals are good animals because the extent of our power is so large that they are all submitted to our will. But not all of them are depicted as conscient living beings with the will and the right to live. The press keeps showing some animals like cattle as they were objects. And this is a problem because you know that most of our ecological problems are related to animal farming, for example. And we need these animals, their suffering, to be considered. I'm coming to my conclusion, and I would like you to think a little about this picture, because it shows us that it doesn't matter if it's a wild animal or cattle. They all experience the same suffering and the same problems when it comes to disasters and tragedies. We know that things will get worse. We don't even know if Pantanal will survive the problems that we are facing. I consider myself part of Pantanal. What we suggest and what we do here in Mato Grosso State University, we offer courses about animal studies and media. We have outreach programs about it. And what we propose a lot of things, but I will stress one out here today, is the non-human animals inclusion in the ethical domain of the press. As journalists, I'm a journalist, we all always ask ourselves when we are writing our stories, what impact will it have on other people's lives? But most of us we don't ask the impact that news will have on other animals' lives. And that's the first proposition that we have, that journalists starts to think about that. When a person is writing a story, the person should ask herself, how it will impact these animals' lives. We have a powerful example that is the monkeypox disease. And this single name, it's creating a lot of problems to monkeys all around the world. So what we propose is that all animals are depicted in their will and their right to live. To mitigate these problems, we need a cultural change. Unless we change our culture, we will still be facing a lot of ecological problems. Journalism is a powerful tool to make people think, to change opinions, to make people understand that all animals have consciousness and they have feelings and emotions and they want to live just like us. And it is also a powerful tool to make people pressure government to take action. So I would like to thank you all again for the opportunity. These are my contacts. I would love to hear from you, to hear your questions and to know more about your researches or to discuss my research. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to present on disaster planning requirements for U.S. laboratories. So speaking specifically about animals in the laboratory in the United States. A little bit about myself, you can read here, some of it was just covered in the introduction. I do always like to acknowledge that one of my most proud information is that I'm the human caretaker of my cat Cash and my indoor dog, who are pictured here. Also, in the obligatory disclaimer, I am currently a fellow at Johns Hopkins, but the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the university or the Bloomberg School of Public Health. I also am very honored to be part of this panel today, and I've already learned a lot about how I might change some of my practice, including the images I include in my presentation. But for today's purposes, I will say that all images are stock photos, common license, or otherwise used with permission. So for my presentation today, I'm going to sort of walk through these three elements. First, I'm going to start with the legal scheme for disaster planning in the US for laboratory animals. Then I'm going to talk about lessons from recent disasters within the United States and talk briefly about potential issues and ways that we can improve our legal scheme for caring for animals in labs in the US. And for those of you who aren't based in the United States, I hope that this may be an example of both the what to do and what not to do in your own jurisdictions. So really quickly here, just to give you a sense of scope, in the United States, it's estimated that over 1 million animals are used in US labs each year. I have an asterisk here because the major way that we obtain this number is through reporting requirements under the Animal Welfare Act. And the Animal Welfare Act, unfortunately, excludes birds, mice, and rats and its scope. And so they are not covered in these numbers. And so when I say estimated over 1 million animals, emphasis on the over. Also, when we're talking about the disasters that the US has faced and the impacts that has on animals in the lab, here are just some numbers related to both the recent pandemic. With COVID-19, we're actually still getting in a lot of the information. So I just wrote here thousands plus. And then 3 semi-recent hurricanes that were majorly impacted animals used in laboratory and around that 10,000 category. So a very large number of animals are in labs are impacted by disasters. The types of disasters labs should consider, I've listed some here. The short answer for this is that they should consider all disasters that could potentially impact their laboratory. You can divide these into a couple different categories, but I've listed here some natural, the infrastructure issues, and then we also have what I've encompassed as the public health or man-made, so our pandemic, active shooter, and war. Okay, so what laws apply? The way I've listed it here, these 4 items are hierarchical by the requirement force as well as their scope. But what I really want to hone in on is this 3rd item, which is the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, otherwise known as the Guide. This is the main source of the disaster planning requirements for US laboratories when we're dealing with animals. And I will speak in a moment to those requirements outlined there. From a strictly legal requirement, this guide is written by a nonprofit or a non-legal body. It's not a government body. But the Public Health Service Policy, also known as the PHS policy, specifically requires laboratories to use the guide to create a disaster plan. The PHS policy applies to any laboratory receiving federal funding, which is a great number of laboratories, although not all. And then the Animal Welfare Act applies more broadly to all research facilities. I've included here both the initial guide and then the subsequent guide for the care and use of ag animals in research and teaching. This is a separate guide specifically for the use of agricultural or farmed animals in science. So interestingly, the Animal Welfare Act, which many of you may be familiar with, is the United States' main animal welfare law. There was no requirement for disaster planning under the AWA until 2012. This seems like they've kind of come late to the table, although I will say that the guide certainly expanded its requirements in the most recent edition in 2011. And so we're seeing an increased awareness of the need to disaster plan throughout these documents. In 2012, the Animal Welfare Act regulations were amended to require contingency plans. However, in 2013, when they were to go into effect, that was actually stayed. It was postponed, and nothing happened until 2020. And as we all know what happened in 2020, which was the worldwide pandemic, is certainly a serious disaster. And so in 2020, the agency, the USDA or APHIS, required to implement AWA was forced by Congress to remove the stay, to do something. And so subsequently, they have removed the stay. Unfortunately, as of this start of this year, the new rule is in place, and all labs are required to be compliant as of July of this year. So I mentioned I would talk about the guide and the legal requirements that it outlines. So here we have sort of the very basics, what we have to do. You have to have a plan. And really, you have to have a plan that is specific to your location and your facility. You have to prioritize critical or irreplaceable animals, which I think relates to the conversation about, are we protecting these animals for their intrinsic value, or are we protecting them because they're an economic investment? You also have to train your employees. So you have to identify key responsible employees. You have to have written procedures in place. You have to train them, and then you have to actually practice your disaster response. And this is something that I look forward to investigating a bit further, because as many of us know, it is difficult to anticipate the consequences of a disaster. And so I am curious to better understand, when they practice their response to the disasters, what components are being included in that practice and what components are maybe being left out. You have to report deviations from protocols to the overseeing agency. So if the disaster results in a suspension of your protocol, you have to report that. And this is really interesting because it allows us to access information that we otherwise might not be able to, because the information is being sent directly to the agency. And finally, you're to share the plan with the IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, your institutional facility, and your local authorities for coordinating disaster response purposes. So not required, but commonly included in these disaster plans, you will see both a hierarchy of species as well as a hierarchy of response. So I've included in here an example of a hierarchy of species from the Oregon State University. You can see it's very similar to what you might commonly see when people create a hierarchy of animal species. Starts with primates, moves down to dogs and cats, and ends with other mammals. Now, this hierarchy is not the same throughout all plans. Not all plans necessarily have a hierarchy. But as an example of the University of Georgia, they still include primates at the top, but they actually list dogs, cats, ferrets, and horses all together as their second. Towards the very bottom, they include amphibians, and they actually have a miscellaneous as their eighth, which seems much more expansive in scope than we have here in the Oregon hierarchy. And now, as for hierarchy of response, this came out of a question actually posed to one of the government agencies about the permissibility of euthanizing laboratory animals during a disaster. And the agency response was that there are several steps you are expected to take prior to coming to the conclusion that they must be humanely euthanized. And that is to consider postponing the work you are doing, relocating the animals to a secure facility that's not otherwise impacted by the disaster, and then finally, potentially humanely euthanizing if their welfare cannot otherwise be addressed. So now I will segue us into lessons we can learn from recent events. I'm going to focus on the events that I talked a little bit about earlier, so lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the first takeaways we can see here is that us as humans, we're not particularly good at considering potential disasters that are not in the recent cultural memory. So we've had a lot of hurricane issues in the United States, and we've started to do a better job of incorporating those into our disaster planning. But despite the fact that experts were sort of sounding the alarm bells about a pandemic for years prior to the arrival of COVID-19, very few, if any, laboratory disaster plans had actually considered that potential disaster. Additionally, regardless of the scale of the disaster, regulatory bodies require compliance with disaster preparedness laws. At least that's the public-facing narrative, and I will take it as a start. Access to info can take a very long time. This relates to the issue of transparency. Information in laboratories is not always accessible to the public. Once it's in the hands of the agency, it can become accessible to the public through the Freedom of Information Act. But a lot of times agencies will look at the information on site during inspection rather than take it with them. And so we're often waiting in these cases for reporting requirements, which may only be done annually, for the compilation of those reports, and then for responses to information requests. Finally, in relation to COVID-19, I will say one of the positive potential outcomes is that, so starting with the sad news that several animals were euthanized and sort of en masse at the beginning of the pandemic. The positive news is that many people are now taking this opportunity to have this be an additional reason as why we should advocate for alternatives to animal models in science. And they're saying, we don't need to repopulate these animals in our labs. Let's look at the alternatives and let's push those and bring those to the forefront. Now, when we look at lessons from hurricanes, and I've spoken about Katrina, which impacted primarily New Orleans in the United States, Hurricane Allison, which impacted primarily Texas, and Hurricane Sandy. If we take Hurricane Allison for an example, this was a substantive infrastructure issue. So the hurricane came in and sort of destroyed certain infrastructure that led to the flooding, mass flooding, that the universities in this case were not able to respond to appropriately. Since then, steps have gone into place to correct the infrastructure issues, but this here again relates to our inability to acknowledge the potential disaster, and instead of waiting to simply respond to the disaster, thinking about mitigating steps we can do before the disaster strikes to reduce the loss of animals in our laboratories. So I've alluded to these three potential issues throughout the presentation: transparency, mitigation, and then animal value. And I'm going to walk through each briefly. So on the issue of transparency, the laws and regulations are readily available. They're easy to access and review. However, confirming compliance is much more difficult. And when we can't confirm compliance, it's hard for us to be sure that the laws we have in place are even being utilized to know how we can improve upon those requirements. When we talk about mitigation, so there's no requirement in the United States disaster planning for laboratory animals to mitigate potential disasters. You just have to have a response plan. This was actually identified by the National Academy of Science, who is the authoring body of the guide. And so they even have said themselves, this guide is inadequate. We need to add a requirement to include mitigating steps. And when we think about mitigation, there's both long-term mitigation and short-term mitigation. So long-term mitigation are things like the Hurricane Allison with infrastructure. If we know our building is not flood-proof and we know we're in a flood zone, we need to update our building to make it flood-proof. But also short-term mitigation. So we think about Hurricane Sandy and its impact on New York. In this case, there's one building and one facility in particular that had a basement full of laboratory animals that flooded as a byproduct of Hurricane Sandy. And hurricanes come in fairly quickly, but there was at least 24-hour notice. And many people have said those researchers could have responded by taking that time to move the animals from the basement to a higher level where the floodplains wouldn't have impacted them as much. And I will just wrap up by saying that the animal value is also a question that is a theme throughout these presentations. A lot of the language talks about their economic value. Fortunately, there is some that refers to the animal's intrinsic value. I think to the extent that we can push for more language around the intrinsic value of these animals rather than just purely their economic value, the more we will see laws and regulations that benefit laboratory animals that are becoming casualties of disasters. So thank you.
Bueno, el tema que nos convoca, como se adelantó, es el análisis de una propuesta jurídica en favor de los animales silvestres, referida concretamente a los incendios en la provincia de Corrientes, que tuvieron lugar a partir del año 2022. Para quienes no conozcan Argentina, aquí se tuvo en el mapa a la provincia de Corrientes, y yo les voy a contar un poco, dado que estamos frente a un público extranjero, un poco sobre esta provincia. Es una de las provincias más antiguas de la Argentina, se sitúa en la región noreste, se caracteriza por una gran diversidad biológica, una gran presencia de flora y animales silvestres en bosque y monte. Yo mi foco, obviamente, como animalista lo pongo en animales silvestres, y me gustaría señalar aquí el grado de afectación que tuvo a raíz de estos incendios que datan de comienzos del año 2022, y les quiero señalar que las superficies afectadas fueron más de 1.042.514 hectáreas, lo cual equivale al 12% de la provincia de Corrientes, que fue afectada por el fuego. La zona más afectada por el Ituzaingó, Santo Tomé, y el área que presentó mayor afectación en su superficie fue San Miguel. Estas áreas son relevantes no solamente desde el punto de vista
Antonio? Creo que...
los derechos de los animales silvestres, el Parque Nacional de los Esteros de Liberá. Para quienes no lo conozcan, es una red de lagos, de esteros y de bañados. Es uno de los humedales más grandes de América del Sur. Y entonces, digamos, aquí residen más de 380 especies de aves. Y me gustaría señalar la importancia que tuvo la afectación en incendio de este Parque Nacional, porque allí residen algunas especies únicas en el mundo y que están en riesgo de extinción, como ser el venado de la pampa, que ustedes ven en la foto, el aguaraguazú, que es esta especie de zorro, y esta ave que se conoce como el yetapa de Codar, que solamente se encuentran en la región de Corrientes y en la región chaqueña. Y ahora quiero señalar un poco cuáles han sido las causas de estos incendios, no solamente en Corrientes, sino en el país en general. Esto tiene su antecedente en el año 2019, a raíz del cambio climático. Se ha dado un crecimiento exponencial de las temperaturas, se han producido una serie de sequías. A raíz de esas sequías se han generado, obviamente, a lo largo de 2019, a la fecha, una serie de incendios. Y esta situación del aumento climático, del cambio del clima, genera una bajante del río Paraná, y a la vez causante de incendios son ciertas actividades intencionales y negligentes, como pueden ser las quemas, los desmontes. Quiero señalar que en Argentina existen leyes que regulan el otorgamiento de permisos para quema de pastizales o de vegetación y también para desmonte, pero en la práctica vemos que no son respetados y son realizados más allá de los permisos, lo cual no tiene en cuenta las consecuencias e impactos que tiene sobre el ambiente en general, y muchas de estas prácticas son llevadas a cabo a fin de generar un avance en la frontera agropecuaria en lo que se refiere obviamente a la actividad productiva. En el Gran Chaco, que está abarcado Corrientes, este fenómeno de quema y desmonte se vincula con el avance de la urbanización, se queman grandes bosques, se deforestan terrenos, los cuales, digamos, se caracterizan por su pobreza del suelo, áreas de poca lluvia, y entonces también vemos que esa es una de las causales de estos incendios, y además tenemos que señalar que estos avances sobre montes y bosques a través de la quema y deforestación no solo está orientado a expandir la urbanización, la frontera agropecuaria, sino está vinculado al desarrollo de la infraestructura, extracción minera y extracción maderera, según los datos que provienen del Ministerio de Desarrollo de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sustentable de la Nación del año 2018. Y frente a estas causales me quiero detener en qué rol han tenido los estados. ¿Y por qué hablo de estados? Porque en Argentina, que es un estado federal, encontramos un estado nacional y encontramos una serie de provincias y hay una serie de distribución de facultades con relación a ello. Me quiero referir específicamente al rol que ha cumplido el Estado Nacional. Desde 2019 a la fecha se ha caracterizado en primer lugar por un alto grado de improvisación, carencia de fuentes o de redes de información para determinar causales de estos incendios y medidas de prevención. Y otra cuestión fundamental es la reducción que ha habido del presupuesto. En Argentina encontramos dos sistemas para combatir o prevenir incendios. Un sistema de gestión.
Sí, ahí vemos si Antonio recupera, si no sigo yo con la presentación. Bueno, básicamente era contarles un poco, Antonio, si ya recuperaste la conexión, seguí.
¿En qué parte había quedado?
En la falta de coordinación entre los estados nacionales y provinciales.
Lo vuelvo a explicar. Bueno, habíamos quedado que en el Estado Federal argentino habían dos grandes unidades, el Estado Nacional y las provincias, y entre ellas hay una suerte de distribución de competencia en materia ambiental. Lo que me gustaría señalar aquí, que el Estado Nacional, como las provincias, se caracterizaron por un alto nivel de improvisación y no cuentan a la fecha con una suerte de red de información, de investigación sobre causales y mecanismos de prevención. Y otra cuestión fundamental que refleja esta improvisación y también digamos, este rol débil del Estado para atender los incendios viene dado por la reducción presupuestaria. En Argentina encontramos dos sistemas que se refieren a atender la cuestión de los incendios o, si se quiere, prevención también de otros desastres, que es el sistema de gestión de riesgo de desastre y el sistema nacional de manejo del fuego. Estos sistemas atravesaron una serie de recortes presupuestarios y vemos que entre los recortes encontramos que se ha reducido el número de horas de vuelo del sistema aéreo destinado a la prevención y lucha contra incendios. Vemos que para el año 2021 está previsto en el presupuesto 3.500 horas de vuelo y en el año 2020 se habían previsto ser financiadas 6.230 horas de vuelo. También hubo una reducción en cuanto a los gastos que se destinarían al personal, hubo una reducción de agentes destinados a combatir los incendios. Para el año 2021 se estableció que serían 1.000 agentes los que se destinarían a combatir incendios, en contraste con el año 2020, que eran 1.800 y 2.000 en el 2019. Y vemos que también hay una reducción presupuestaria, como ven en el número, en cuanto al equipamiento de unidades regionales. Y otro factor que me gustaría señalar en cuanto a este rol débil del Estado es la carencia de recursos de investigación que están previstas en esta ley que ven aquí, que es de manejo del fuego, que a la fecha nunca se creó el área de investigación. Y otra cuestión clave aquí es la falta de coordinación entre el Estado Nacional y provincia. En cada una de las leyes argentinas se prevé una suerte de federalismo de concertación, es decir, concordar, consensuar políticas públicas para atender incendios, pero en la práctica lo que ocurre es que el Estado Nacional centraliza las decisiones, en muchos casos desconoce la realidad o características locales de las áreas afectadas. A eso debemos agregar que existe corriente que específicamente vamos a señalar un ejemplo concreto, que el Gobierno Nacional frente a los incendios de 2022 manifestó que realizó una serie de ofertas para atender o financiar la cuestión y la provincia de Corrientes las denegó por una cuestión de ideología política y la provincia de Corrientes negó que haya recibido tales ofertas. Habiendo visto el rol del Estado, me quiero detener un poco que en los incendios muchas veces se ha puesto el foco en las víctimas humanas, y aquí nosotros vamos a señalar cuáles son las víctimas no humanas. Yo me quiero detener en los informes de la Fundación Allende y de la Fundación FAR, donde hablan de víctimas de la flora y la fauna, pero no ponen el foco en los animales silvestres individuales, no ponen el foco en las áreas ni determinan cuáles fueron los daños que han sufrido estos animales. Sí señalan que se vio afectado el hábitat, se vio destruido, que presentaba, digamos, esta zona donde residían los animales, una gran diversidad y una abundancia. Sí me parece importante, y esto sí lo señala FARN, es que en este hecho han perecido invertebrados como ser insectos, así como vertebrados. O sea que aquí se igualiza, a diferencia de otros informes que podemos encontrar. La crítica que debemos hacer a cada informe que encontramos en materia ambiental, que da cuenta de la consecuencia de los incendios, es que nunca visibilizan a los demás animales como señalos, como individuos, y qué derechos se ven afectados. El enfoque de derecho exige esa suerte de individualización, hacer visible a estos animales. Y ahora me quiero referir al fundamento ético de por qué intervenir frente a estos contextos. En primer lugar, la ética claramente nos señala que los animales son seres sintientes, tienen un valor inherente, y de la sintiencia se desprenden una serie de derechos universales, la vida, la libertad y el hábitat, y obviamente que si estos derechos son vulnerados por la acción humana, obviamente es mayor el grado de responsabilidad, y también los animales silvestres tienen autonomía, tienen una actitud para afrontar los desafíos del entorno y perseguir sus preferencias. Estos incendios provocados, ya sea en forma directa o indirecta por el hombre, han restringido esta autonomía y también la soberanía política, porque para quien indica, los animales silvestres gozan de una actitud como comunidad de afrontar todos los desafíos del entorno y valerse por sí mismos, y obviamente frente a restricciones de la soberanía es necesaria la intervención del Estado, y sobre todo aquí debemos destacar que los animales fueron colocados en un estado de necesidad, y como otro fundamento debemos señalar que estos animales tienen una serie de capacidades que tienen que florecer y no deben ser puestos obstáculos, y el Estado debe eliminarlos. Ese sería el fundamento de la intervención. Y en materia normativa, nosotros vamos a hacer, si bien recordemos que el sistema jurídico argentino es predominantemente antropocéntrico, nosotros planteamos que hay que hacer una relectura de la Constitución Nacional, en primer lugar, poniendo el foco en los animales, y para ello nosotros vamos a tomar como punto de partida la idea de habitante, la vamos a interpretar a este concepto de forma dinámica, este concepto indeterminado, e interpretaremos que habitante implica todo ser sintiente que reside en el territorio argentino, abarcando a los demás animales, y los habitantes tienen, según el artículo 16, el derecho a la igualdad ante la ley, que nosotros interpretaremos igualdad de consideración de intereses como ser la vida, la libertad y el hábitat. Y en tanto habitante, los animales un derecho a que se preserve el ambiente, vinculado obviamente a la preservación de sus vidas, es indivisible el ambiente al desarrollo vital de los mismos y al hábitat de los mismos, por lo cual nosotros afirmamos que tiene esta titularidad los demás animales, y a la vez el artículo 19 consagra la autonomía, entendida como la capacidad de realizar el proyecto vital, se refería a los humanos, pero tomando esta palabra habitante abarcaremos a los demás animales, y digamos que frente a, o sea, de la idea de autonomía se desprende que deben prevenirse todos daños que impliquen una restricción a este proyecto vital. Ese es el principio de prevención, y este principio se encuentra consagrado en la Ley General de Medio Ambiente y también en otras leyes que señalé, como la Ley de Presupuestos Mínimos de Manejo del Fuego. Y otro principio que aquí también funda la intervención en favor de los animales es que las actividades productivas, antrópicas, no deben poner en riesgo los proyectos vitales de las generaciones futuras, tanto humanas como no humanas. Me gustaría agregar un principio que fue elaborado por la Corte Suprema a partir de la idea del derecho al ambiente, que plantea que cuando las autoridades judiciales se encuentren frente a una duda en cuanto al daño al ambiente, debe interpretarse siempre en favor de la preservación del ambiente, y aquí yo interpreto que el titular del ambiente serían los demás animales, Y aquí agregaría como principio, como desprendimiento, dado que los animales son integrantes del ambiente, que deben interpretarse las normas en caso de duda en favor de la preservación de los derechos de los demás animales. Y ahora le cedo la palabra a la compañera Natalia, la cual, tomando estos fundamentos normativos, explicará cómo debe concretarse esta intervención.
Bueno, en razón del tiempo y que nos queda un minuto, solamente le queríamos presentar que a raíz de trabajo de investigación y actuando en cuestiones de fuego, vimos de que los agentes, digamos, involucrados, por ejemplo los bomberos, no están preparados para el rescate de fauna silvestre. Entonces la idea es redactamos en realidad un protocolo de actuación dividido en estas tres partes: en la prevención, cuando se actúa ya ante el desastre, y post-desastre, que es la rehabilitación del hábitat y la reinserción de esos animales afectados por el fuego. Esto no solamente se puede aplicar en caso de incendios, sino también, por ejemplo, en inundaciones, en tornados, en terremotos que se puedan hacer. La idea es crear una brigada especial que atienda el salvamiento de esta fauna silvestre, estos ejemplares, para tratar de evitar la mayor cantidad de pérdidas posibles. Si por ahí tienen alguna duda que la quieran plasmar en las preguntas, de explicarlo un poco, más que abiertos, y no me quiero pasar en el tiempo, así que bueno, muchísimas gracias. Ahí le vamos a dejar los contactos por si desean mayor información con respecto a esto.